The sky above Varkath 7 burned in hues of deep orange and muted gold, as the Erebus, a massive colony-class warship, descended toward the planet's desolate surface. The air was dry, thick with iron dust that swept across the barren wasteland, like ghostly fingers, clawing at the metallic hull of the descending vessel. The ship's enormous silhouette darkened the terrain below, casting a long, eerie shadow over the awaiting figures. A battalion of human soldiers, clad in gleaming white armored suits, standing in perfect formation on the cracked desert floor. The MI. Ship's landing thrusters ignited, blasting pillars of red-tinged dust into the air. The roar of the engines sent tremors through the ground, unsettling the silent, stagnant atmosphere of the planet. The soldiers, unwavering, held their positions, their reflective visors concealing their faces, their weapons slung across their chests in a state of readiness. No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the mechanical hum of the support, drones floating overhead and the distant screech of high-altitude escort ships patrolling the upper atmosphere. A single voice crackled through the soldiers' helmet comms. "Stay in formation. Stand by for mission briefing." Commander Rhys Arden stood at the front, the weight of command pressing against his shoulders. He had seen dozens of deployments in his time, but something about Varkath 7 felt different. The mission brief had been unusually vague, the orders shrouded in bureaucratic jargon, filled with phrases like classified excavation and secured intelligence asset. Rhys had been in enough campaigns to know when the higher-ups were keeping secrets. The ship's massive hull doors groaned open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the Erebus. From within, teams of heavy-duty mining units began rolling out, their mechanical limbs clanking as they moved toward the barren expanse. Ahead, following them, a procession of high-ranking officers in black command suits emerged, their expressions cold and unreadable. As Rhys watched them approach, his helmet HUD scanned the horizon, no visible threats. And yet, unease crawled up his spine. The atmosphere was too still, too empty. He adjusted his rifle. This wasn't a battle. It was something else entirely. The metallic clang of boots echoed inside the Erebus's command deck, where a group of high-ranking officers gathered around a holographic display. The air inside the ship was cooler, sterile, a stark contrast to the oppressive heat outside. Commander Rhys Arden stood among the assembled squad leaders, his expression unreadable as he listened to the mission briefing. At the center of the room, General Nathaniel Voss surveyed them with a calculating gaze. His gray uniform, adorned with a row of service medals, barely moved as he spoke in a clipped, authoritative tone. "You all know why you're here," he began, tapping a control on his wrist. The hologram above the table flickered to life, displaying a deep scan of Varkath 7's surface. The desert was vast, empty, except for one massive underground structure, its architecture alien and unfamiliar. "Your objective is twofold," Voss continued. 1. Establish a fortified presence around the landing site. We need full perimeter control before nightfall. 2. He paused, his eyes narrowing. You will assist the excavation teams in retrieving a classified object beneath the surface. All further details are on a need-to-know basis. A murmur spread through the gathered soldiers. Excavation? This wasn't standard planetary colonization. Rhys crossed his arms. "Sir, are we expecting resistance?" Voss's gaze snapped to him. "There is no intelligent life on Varkath 7, he replied. "But we are not the first to set foot here. This planet has history, and we will not be the last." The holographic map zoomed, in revealing a colossal monolithic structure buried beneath the sand, glowing with a faint energy signature. Rhys could make out strange symbols etched into its surface even in the dim light. "Whatever is down there," Voss continued, "it's ancient, older than any recorded civilization we've encountered. The data we extract will shift the balance of power in our favor." Rhys's fingers tightened around his belt. He had fought in enough wars to recognize when something wasn't right. Missions like these, where soldiers were treated like disposable assets, had a way of turning into disasters. Behind him, Lieutenant Eva Kane, one of his squad's best scouts, leaned in and whispered, "They're hiding something." Reese nodded subtly. He could feel it too. As the briefing concluded, squads were dismissed to prepare for deployment, but as Reese and Eva left the command deck, they were stopped by Colonel Elias Darrow, the intelligence officer overseeing the mission. "Commander, a word." Darrow's voice was calm but firm. Reese exchanged a glance with Eva before stepping aside. "I assume you have questions," Darrow said. Reese didn't hesitate. "Why bring an entire battalion for an excavation, and what aren't you telling us about what's beneath the sand?" Darrow exhaled, glancing around as if ensuring they were alone. Then he tapped a control on his forearm. A private holo display flickered into existence. Unlike the sanitized briefing version, this scan was raw, unfiltered. The image of the buried structure was sharper, revealing twisting corridors, massive chambers, and hundreds of lifeless figures scattered throughout its halls. Human figures. Bodies. "We are not the first to attempt this," Darrow admitted. 30 years ago, an expeditionary team discovered this site. None of them returned. Reese felt his jaw tighten. "And yet we're sending thousands of men down there?" "That's the difference." "This time," Darrow said, "we have an army. Whatever went wrong before, we will not make the same mistake." Reese didn't believe that for a second. Eva spoke up, her voice a whisper. "What exactly killed them?" Darrow hesitated. "We don't know. The records were classified. The last transmission received from the team said only 2 words before it cut out completely." He turned the holo display toward them, replaying a distorted transmission filled with static. The voice was frantic, broken, but unmistakably human. "They're awake." The screen went black. Reese's stomach turned cold, orders and doubts back in. The armory, soldiers strapped into their gear, prepping weapons and power cells for the excavation mission. Conversations buzzed among them, whispers of classified dangers, legends about the planet, and unease over the general secrecy. Reese moved through the ranks, masking his own growing concern. The mission was no longer just about securing a foothold, it was about survival. He found Sergeant Aiden Cross, one of his closest men, already loading supplies onto an armored transport. "You're worried," Aiden said without looking up. Reese sighed. "Aren't you?" Aiden smirked grimly. "I've learned not to ask questions. Just shoot what doesn't belong." Reese wished it were that simple. From outside the ship, the first excavation, teams deployed, their white armored figures moving toward the ruins like ants marching toward an unseen predator. As Reese watched them go, one thought gnawed at him. What if the enemy wasn't outside the walls of the Erebus? What if it was already inside? The sun hung low in the hazy, dust-choked sky as the first wave of excavation teams advanced across Varkath 7's cracked terrain. The planet was quiet. Too quiet. Reese Arden and his squad moved in formation, their boots crunching against the brittle reddish ground. They followed the survey beacons, marking the safest route toward the buried structure. The deeper they ventured, the more unnatural the landscape became. Massive, half-buried structures jutted from the sand, like the bones of a forgotten civilization. At the site's center, a gaping fissure stretched wide, revealing a massive subterranean complex below. Its walls were lined with alien inscriptions glowing faintly beneath the surface. Reese's HUD translated nothing. This language wasn't in any known database. "All right, keep your eyes open," Reese said over comms. "If anything moves that isn't us, I want to know about it." Eva Kane, the squad scout, knelt beside a partially buried pillar, tracing a gloved hand over the etched symbols. "This writing, it looks like a warning," she murmured. Reese frowned. "What does it say?" Eva's visor flickered as her AI assistant tried to parse the meaning. After a moment, the translation displayed, "They wait beneath. Do not speak to them. Do not set them free." Reese's pulse quickened. Before he could respond, a voice crackled through their comms. "Sergeant Aiden Cross from the West Excavation Team. Commander, we've got something. You're gonna want to see this." They moved swiftly, following Aiden's beacon to a newly uncovered passageway. The entryway was massive, lined with colossal statues, figures clad in ornate armor, their faces hidden behind featureless masks. The air inside was stale and cold. Despite the heat outside, Aiden stood at the entrance, his weapon raised. "We sent a drone ahead," he said. It stopped transmitting after 30 meters. Then we heard this. He tapped his wrist display, playing back a looping audio feed. A sound filled the comms, low, whispering voices overlapping in dozens of unintelligible tongues. It wasn't static. It was as speech. Reese's grip tightened on his rifle. "Did anyone respond?" he asked. Aiden shook his head. "Hell no." Reese took a slow breath and turned to his squad. "All right. We go in slow. No unnecessary noise. We do not respond." With weapons ready, they stepped inside. The chamber swallowed them whole, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Their helmet lights cut through the void, revealing walls covered in shifting, pulsating symbols. The deeper they moved, the more the whispers grew, not louder but closer. Then a sudden distant scream shattered the silence. "What was that?" Eva hissed. The squad froze. The sound had come from deeper inside the ruins. "Cross-check your squad count," Reese ordered. Aiden scanned his squad list, his breath caught. "We're missing. Wait, no. That's impossible." "What?" Aiden turned his screen toward Reese. The biometric readouts showed that every soldier was still alive. But two of them, Private Hale and Specialist Wren, had simply vanished. No comms, no signal, just gone. Then, the whispers stopped. Reese felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. That's when he heard it, a single breath directly behind him. He spun around, nothing but darkness. The missing soldiers were still gone, but something else was here. The squad pressed deeper, pushing past the threshold of fear, determined to find their missing men. Every step forward felt like a mistake, but turning back didn't feel like an option anymore. Then they found it. A massive underground antechamber. At its center lay a colossal, alien monolith, pulsing with an unnatural, faint blue glow. The structure was humming, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt inside their bones, and at its base, the missing soldiers stood motionless. Reese's stomach twisted. Their armor was intact. Their vitals were normal. But something about them was wrong. "Hale, Wren, report," Reese ordered. No response. Eva stepped closer, her weapon drawn. "Guys, do you hear me?" Hale turned his head slowly, as if waking from a dream. His visor reflected nothing but the monolith's glow. Then he spoke. "They are dreaming," he whispered, "and we are waking them." Reese tightened his grip on his weapon as Private Hale's words echoed through the chamber. "They are dreaming, and we are waking them." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the low hum of the monolith, vibrating deep in Reese's chest like a pulse too old, too alien to belong to anything human. Then Specialist Wren moved. His body jerked unnaturally, like a marionette cut from its strings. His head tilted upward, staring at something none of them could see. His breathing grew ragged, his fingers twitching against the trigger of his rifle. Reese stepped forward cautiously. "Wren, stand down." No response. Aiden shifted uneasily beside him. "Commander, I don't think he's—" Wren screamed. Not a human scream. A deep, guttural wail that felt like it came from somewhere else entirely. His body convulsed violently, his armor cracking open in places as if something inside him was expanding, pushing against his skin. Then his visor shattered. A black mist, thick, oily, and writhing, poured from his mouth and eye sockets, swirling, upward like tendrils of smoke. It moved with purpose, slithering through the air like it was alive. That's when the whispers returned. This time, they weren't distant. They were inside their helmets. "Run." It wasn't a command. It was a mockery. Eva opened fire first. Her pulse rifle sent a barrage of blue-hot energy rounds straight into Wren's chest, but the mist didn't stop. It spread, curling around her bullets, absorbing them as if they had never existed. The moment the shots rang out, the monolith reacted. The symbols across its surface flared to life, shifting and rearranging into something new. The ground beneath them trembled. Deep within the ruins something groaned. Not metal, not stone. Something alive. Rhys barked orders over the comms. Fall back. Now. The squad broke into a sprint, tearing away from the chamber as the mist spread like wildfire, moving faster than it should have been possible. As they ran, the walls changed. Passages they had come through before sealed shut. New ones opened. The ruins were reconfiguring around them like a living maze designed to trap intruders. Then the statues moved. The once lifeless stone figures, standing guard at the entryways, began to shift, their featureless faces splitting, open to reveal black voids where eyes should be. One of them turned its head toward Rhys. Then it spoke. "You should not have come." Rhys fired a shot into its skull. The statue didn't even flinch. Instead, it stepped forward. They had minutes, maybe seconds, before the ruins consumed them whole. Rhys activated his helmet beacon, marking an emergency extraction point for the dropships above. Command. We need immediate evac. The ruins are shifting and we've got an unknown hostile presence. No response. Static. Rhys's heartbeat pounded in his ears. Command. Do you copy? A voice finally crackled through. But it wasn't command. It was a voice he had never heard before. Your voices are new. Rhys's breath caught. We are listening. The mist lunged. One of the soldiers, Private Lorne, screamed as the darkness swallowed him whole. His armor crumpled inward, his body shriveling, as if the mist was draining him. Dry. His scream cut off. What remained of him collapsed into the dust, just an empty shell of armor. Rhys forced himself to move. Run. They sprinted toward the surface, dodging falling debris as the ruins shook violently, the very foundation collapsing in on itself. By the time they reached the surface, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the desert into an eerie twilight. The dropships were nowhere in sight. Rhys turned to look back at the ruins. The entrance they had just escaped from was gone, as if it had never been there in the first place. And somewhere, deep beneath the sand, the monolith continued to hum. Something had awakened, and it was still waiting. The sky above Varkath 7 had deepened into a burnt orange twilight, the sun's last light flickering against the crimson desert sands. But Rhys didn't care about the sunset. He cared about the silence. The squad stood at the excavation site's edge, gasping for breath, their armor coated in dust and sweat. Their visors reflected the lifeless wasteland around them, except it wasn't lifeless anymore. Behind them, the ruins were gone. The entrance, the monolith, the shifting walls, all buried beneath the sand like they had never been there. But Rhys knew what he saw, what they all saw. Where the hell is the evac? Eva's voice came through the comms, sharp with panic. Rhys switched to command frequency. Command, do you read? We need immediate extraction. The ruins collapsed and we have... The comms hissed with static. No response. Aiden cursed under his breath. The Erebus should have had us locked on their scanners. Why aren't they responding? Rhys's gut twisted. There was no way command would just go dark, not unless something had happened. Then a new voice crackled through, a voice that didn't belong to command. You were warned. It was deep, layered, like 100 voices speaking in unison. It wasn't human. Rhys felt a cold chill run through him. Eva froze beside him. Did anyone else hear that? Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them rumbled. And then, the lights appeared. At first, it looked like stars blinking in the distance. Small, blue orbs of light flickered across the desert floor, at least a dozen at first, then dozens more. Within seconds, they were everywhere, forming an unnatural perimeter around the squad. The whispers returned louder now, and then the shapes emerged. Figures rose from the sand, tall and thin, their faces obscured by darkness. They moved silently, their forms shifting like liquid shadow, as if they weren't entirely solid. The squad raised their weapons. Rhys? Aiden's voice was low, shaken. Rhys's pulse pounded. The figures didn't attack, they just stood there watching, waiting. We need to move, Reese whispered. Slowly, back toward the outpost. The squad took a step back. The figures took a step forward. Eva exhaled sharply. That's not good. Then the whispers stopped. For a fraction of a second, everything was silent. Then the figures moved. They didn't run. They didn't lunge. They simply flickered, vanishing and reappearing closer. In an instant, one of them was right in front of Private Kelso. Kelso screamed as the shadow grabbed him, its fingers sinking through his armor like it wasn't even there. His body jerked violently, his visor filling with static, and then he was gone. Vanished. His armor fell to the ground. Empty. Open fire! Reese shouted. The squad unleashed hell. Pulse rifles lit up the desert, streaks of blue plasma tearing through the night. The creatures staggered, but they didn't fall. Then the shadows retaliated. One lunged for Aiden, its hand passing straight through his chest plate. Aiden gasped, his body locking up, his breath catching. Reese grabbed him, yanking. Him back! Go! He barked. They ran. The distant glow of floodlights came into view, the outpost perimeter. The heavy gun turrets stood ready, their barrels tracking motion. Reese activated his comms again. Outpost, we are coming in hot. Get those turrets online now. This time someone responded. Commander, Wait. What's... A garbled scream. Then, silence. Reese's chest tightened. They reached the perimeter fence, vaulting over it just as the shadows descended. The turrets roared to life, spewing plasma fire in every direction. The creatures shrieked, their forms dispersing like smoke under the bombardment. For a moment it seemed like they were winning. Then the lights inside the outpost flickered and went out. Total darkness. The whispers returned, deafening now. Reese turned toward the base and felt his stomach drop. The garrison soldiers, the ones stationed at the outpost, were standing perfectly still. Hundreds of them, their heads tilted slightly, their eyes glowing a dull, eerie blue. They turned in unison and started walking toward them. Reese's blood went cold. They're already inside. The outpost was no longer theirs. Hundreds of soldiers, men and women who had once stood at attention in gleaming white armor, now moved with eerie, unbroken synchrony. Their helmets had cracks along the visors, revealing cold, glowing blue, eyes underneath. Their heads were tilted at unnatural angles, and their movements were too smooth, too perfect, like puppets on invisible strings. Reese felt his pulse hammering in his skull. They're compromised, Eva whispered. All of them. No one argued. Aiden gritted his teeth. What the hell do we do? The answer came when one of the turned soldiers raised his weapon. The rest followed. Get to cover, Reese shouted. Gunfire erupted. Plasma rounds lit up the dark, streaking across the outpost perimeter as Reese and his remaining squad dived behind a cargo container. The turned soldiers moved forward with mechanical precision, firing in perfect synchronization. There was no hesitation, no fear, only purpose, Eva cursed, firing back. They don't even flinch. Reese checked his ammo count. Not good. Command's gone. The outpost is compromised. The Erebus isn't responding. Aiden's voice was grim. We're out of options. Reese's mind raced. There had to be a way. There was always a way. Then he looked up, toward the central fusion core at the heart of the outpost. And he knew. Blow the base, Eva and Aiden snapped their heads toward him. Are you insane? Aiden demanded. If we don't, those things will spread, Reese shot back. We can't let them leave this planet. Eva clenched her jaw. She knew he was right. How? Reese glanced at his HUD. The base's self-destruct codes were locked behind a command-level authorization, but he wasn't planning to use the official override. He was going to detonate the reactor manually. I need cover, he said. Eva and Aiden exchanged a look. We'll buy you time. Reese exhaled, nodding. See you on the other side. And then he ran. The outpost interior was a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered in the hallways, helmets shattered, their eyes still glowing faintly in the dark. Some were twitching, their fingers still grasping at their weapons, even in death. Reese didn't stop to look. He sprinted through the corridors, heading straight for the reactor chamber. His comms crackled. "Commander, they're pushing us back." Aiden's voice was strained. "We can't hold much longer." Reese pushed harder. Then, a voice whispered inside his helmet. Not over comms, inside his mind. "You cannot stop this." Reese ignored it. He reached the reactor chamber, slamming his palm against the override console. The reactor's fail-safe protocols flashed red, locking him out. It didn't matter. He had another way. Reese pulled 2 thermal charges from his belt. If the system wouldn't let him trigger an overload, he would force one. He set the charges directly against the fusion core. As he activated the final timer, he heard a low, guttural sound behind him, a whisper, a breath. It was never yours to destroy. Reese turned and saw it. A formless black mass, shifting and flickering, as if reality itself was trying to reject it. It had no true shape, only the suggestion of limbs, of faces, of voices stolen from 1,000 souls. The entity loomed over him. Reese could barely breathe. "You think yourself the hero," it murmured. "But you are only delaying the inevitable." Reese lifted his detonator. "Then I guess we'll find out." And he pressed the trigger. The fall of Varkath 7, Aiden and Eva saw it before they felt it. A single blinding pulse of white light erupted from the outpost's core. Then, the explosion. The shockwave tore through the base, sending fire and debris ripping across the desert. The ground fractured, the ruins beneath it collapsing in on themselves, and in the heart of the blast, the monolith shattered. For a brief moment. Just a moment. The shadows screamed, and then they were gone. The final transmission. The Erebus never responded. The outpost was wiped from the surface of Varkath 7. No signals, no survivors. Days later, an automated distress beacon was detected from orbit. It contained a single transmission, a voice. Reese Arden's voice. Varkath 7 must remain untouched. It is not a world to conquer. It is a prison. And now, I am part of it. The message ended, and in the empty burning ruins of the outpost, a single blue light flickered, waiting, listening, dreaming. Weeks later, an expedition drone from a passing colony frigate arrived at Varkath 7. The ship scanned the planet. No signs of life, no heat signatures, no ruins, as if nothing had ever been there at all. But before the drone could leave, something else appeared. A signal. Faint. A whisper. "They are dreaming." The drone's systems glitched. Then, a new command was issued. Return to Earth. The drone's thrusters ignited, and the virus spread. The entity was no longer trapped on Varkath 7, it was coming home.